Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks to Penwell and to Distributech. Of course, we've had many jokes about the weather already this morning. I'm delighted to be here. And I must say, looking at the international scene, which is frankly a mess, and looking at the weather forecast, which is frankly a mess, the only thing I can conclude is that Washington, D.C. is in the critical path of both. I'm a 25-year resident of Washington, D.C., and that's part of what I want to talk to you about today, to put the subject at hand into a broad strategic context. We've had many jokes about Washington. President John F. Kennedy, whose 50th anniversary of his inauguration just occurred, used to say that Washington's one of those wonderful city that combines all the attributes of Southern efficiency and Northern hospitality. Harry Truman was a little tougher on the city. He said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. But actually, my grandfather once said, this is a slightly more serious note, that Washington has many problems, but perhaps its biggest problem is everyone living there is so far from home. Let me just say that it's a pleasure to be here because you're presumably not Washingtonians, and I come to areas outside of the nation's capital to gain energy and excitement about the future, because the awards today were a perfect example of the extraordinary developments that are underway in our country, a kind of can-do spirit across the country that I wish in some ways were a little bit more reflected in Washington, D.C. But I think that there's some reasons for that. You know, when I first started my career, I worked for a gentleman who'd played a rather important industrial role during World War II, and he had a big poster of an ape behind his mahogany desk, and this ape was sort of lying over on his side with this very weary look on his face, and the caption said, "Just when I figured out the answers to life, they went and changed the questions." This is what is underway right now, both globally and domestically. I think many people in Washington, and perhaps across the country, don't yet have a clear idea of how fundamentally certain things have changed. I think that aphorism about the answers to life and the changing questions could never be more appropriate than they are now. We've just been through an economic meltdown. Climate change is on the lips of at least many, if not all, Americans. We have high oil prices compared to the historic levels. We have a messy international situation, actually a very dangerous international situation with no framework for resolution. We have a $1.5 trillion budget deficit. This is unprecedented for our country. Let's not talk about the federal debt, almost 50% of which is owned by foreign countries. We have rivals across the world, or at least we see them as rivals. And it's only just beginning to dawn on us that these problems can't be solved simply with tax cuts, spending cuts, or stimulus funding. Well, I think the description of me as a strategist, I like to think of myself as that. Maybe it's as much genetic as it is by training. But I must say that I see a huge structural and geopolitical readjustment underway. This is a question, though, in my mind, of how we look at the issues in front of us and what our timeline is. It is, in a sense, the short term versus the long term. For a strategist, you'd say that nothing short term should be allowed to erect obstacles for reaching future goals, and yet we see this in our political system all the time. I'd say, I would quote the old expression that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And so let me back up and talk a little bit about a mentor I had for many years, General Andrew J. Goodpaster. General Goodpaster actually worked for George C. Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower. This man had what we would call training. And he used to say to me, you know, Susan, the problem with what's going on today is it's just not serious. It's just not serious because we're not thinking about the critical issues. In other words, what are the long poles in the tent? And of course, he would rattle them off. Of course, fiscal health is a long pole in the tent. Our relations abroad and our military capacity to defend ourselves is a long pole in the tent. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Energy is perhaps the longest pole in the tent. Today, we're in the middle of a global crisis, and if things continue the way they are, the future looks really quite unsustainable. That's because in America, long lead time projects like the kind you've got underway here are harder and harder and harder to sell politically. Part of this is that there are two countervailing trends. One, the necessity to meet long-term challenges such as energy and modernization of our energy portfolio and grid, at the same time meeting climate change imperatives, and to do this in an era of populism where we continually get a validation of our own opinions and ideas that are utterly unburdened by the facts. Every idea and thought today in a place like Washington is given equal validity and value, as if it's all part of the self-esteem process. I certainly was raised at home and under the tutorship of General Goodpaster to pursue rigorously the facts of the case. But people who have this attitude are in few and short supply in Washington. Today, in the energy realm, we have groups who have fallen in love with a certain technology and promote those technologies as if there are going to be tech winners and losers. If you actually look at the numbers, we're going to need everything. So why is it that the energy community still hasn't come together as a community to help our government think about a long-term strategic plan? It's hard to imagine how we think we're going to fuel our economies if we have an environment in which coal and nuclear plants, new plants can't be built. If you just look at the numbers, we're going to need everything, and we're going to have a rigorous process by which we assign some national priorities. The subject of transmission, certainly smart grid had those 28,000 hits last year, but transmission and the national grid itself is hardly even spoken of in my native city. We have the only people who are talking about the transmission grid and the state of its critical circumstances is only discussed in small professional groups, even in a place like Washington. I think it's worth reminding not only ourselves, but of course the policymakers, that electricity is the lifeblood of our economy. As a service economy has blossomed in the last 30 years, over 85% of that growth in energy demand has been supplied by electricity. Rural electrification transformed the American farm, and at the very same time that those developments were occurring, the communist world understood absolutely the connection between electricity and development. As a matter of fact, Vladimir Lenin defined it this way. He said, "Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country." China today has just unveiled an epoch-making 1,000 kV transmission system demonstration project. They, too, understand that electrification is intimately tied to Chinese power. In the United States, our noisy but indispensable democracy, we have our own challenges. We have a difficulty of thinking beyond the 2- and 4-year political term or the quarterly earnings report. Despite the federal government projects, electric power consumption, and accompanying infrastructure to produce and deliver electricity will be 43% greater in 2030 than it is today. And we seem incapable somehow of aligning the facts with the challenge and also the opportunity. The recession, especially in Washington, D.C., has lulled people into forgetting about the long-range growth in energy demand. We make ourselves feel good about talking about all new technologies, but we don't think about how these technologies have to be integrated into a larger system to produce the results we require. While we're tipping our hat to abating climate change and energy independence, we are setting up systems, perhaps, that are going to come online before the very basics are in place. Sources of increased demand are promising and helpful, but impossible to imagine this growth and the strain it's going to put on our transmission infrastructure. Those million cars that President Barack Obama talked about in the State of the Union address, from the estimates I've read, it's only going to take 700,000 electric cars to require 3,785 megawatts of power, additional power, unless plug-in time is staggered. There are other alarming reports about the growth of electronic gadgets. Alarming, I'd say. The International Energy Agency, clearly speaking for the entire world, but still caution that consumer electronics and computers will triple electrical demand by 2030. That is the equivalent of all the electricity consumed today by the United States and Japan. So how are we going to manage this growth in demand when we can barely offer reliability right now? Actually, in truth, our electrical grid in our system is nothing but a miracle. But still, having said that, I think it's worth noting that every day, 500,000 Americans experience blackouts of 2 hours or more. Power disruptions in the United States of America cost the economy $100 billion a year. This comes from a book called Perfect Power by Robert Galvin and Kurt Yeager, and I think it's an extremely interesting book, by the way, and well worth reading. America should be on the fast track to modernization, taking a holistic approach. We operate 10,000 power plants producing 4 trillion kilowatt hours a year. This represents a $500 billion investment, but it's running its course. I know in the nuclear field where I work, we are relicensing plants now for 60 years. It's hard for me to imagine why it wouldn't make more sense to begin a program of decommissioning and organizing a new ramp up in nuclear energy to sustain its share of our electrical generation. But still, these numbers and this plan is so large, so comprehensive, that we simply can't think about them in siloed capacities. There is, of course, enormous emphasis on renewable energy. I'm a great supporter of renewable energy, but we cannot utilize these resources without connecting them to the national grid. The intermittent nature of renewable energy is unsuitable for much of the way the grid is organized. We need to have connections between the high plains and the Southwest, where wind and solar is located, but we also need great advancements in battery technology so that we can actually smooth out the power source, as it were. In other words, we need a modernized system for this modern age in which we're living. Interruptions and disturbances crash servers, assembly lines. All of our modern infrastructure today revolves around sensitive microprocessors. I personally wouldn't want to be on life support at a hospital when the electricity flickers. Interesting that despite the verifiable cost to the economy of these outages and disruptions, investment has not kept pace. In the 1988-1998 time frame, electricity grew by 30%, but in transmission investment only by 15%. In the 1999-2009 time frame, electricity demand grew 20%, and transmission investment only 3%. So today we have a bright new horizon. It's exciting to be a part of it. It's exciting to see what's going on, but we need a larger national way of looking at integrating all of these deferred needs. The smart grid offers significant promise, and I mean that sincerely in every way, not only from bringing critical efficiencies to the transmission grid and producing reliability standards we can be proud of, it also creates the potential for distributed generation, which has enormous impact, as we were hearing. Conservation, appliance standards, it goes on, the list of things that still need to be done, but we have to have a comprehensive approach to both transmission and generation. So how do we get this done in an environment of constrained resources and in a place like Washington, D.C., where the competition for national attention is so fierce? On the political side, I think the biggest problem is that Americans simply cannot conceive that there will be systemic shortages. This I know. I need no convincing, however. I lived in Great Britain in the 1970s when electricity was rationed, that is, cut off, for 3, 6, and 9 hours a day on a rotational basis during 3 winters. That is not a pretty way to try and organize a normal life. I was also on the 29th floor of a New York hotel during the blackout in 2003. The idea that the electricity can go out and can stay out for lengthy periods of time is something I don't need to be convinced of, but many Americans do. Perhaps by the end of this storm that's bearing down on the Midwest and the East Coast, we will be reminded once again of that fact that electricity is the lifeblood, not only of our economy, but of our way of life. So let me say that I think one of the biggest problems we have in terms of framing these issues is a psychological and political one. We have been made to believe, because there are so many exciting new developments down the road, that what is in front of us is not going to be that hard. And this has led many politicians to make promises that we cannot keep. I'd like to single out, I'm sorry about this, but single out Al Gore, who in 2008 gave a very important speech in which he said 100% of our electricity from renewable energy and truly clean carbon-free sources are available, can be possible in 10 years. He said, quote, "This goal is achievable, affordable, and transformative. It represents a challenge to all Americans in every walk of life." It sounds wonderful. In 10 years, 100% of our electricity from renewable resources. We can't get loan guarantees for nuclear power plants, and they are the country's only baseload form of clean energy. So it's hard to know where he was getting those figures. And the net result of that, and even sweeping comments by our president during the State of the Union address, give people the idea that this is only a matter of wishing to innovate, that this is only a matter of political will. In fact, the backlash has already been palatable in the nation's capital. And we have to be very, very careful, I think, to talk to the American people in hopeful, optimistic, but also reasonable terms. Many of the renewable portfolio standards, while a terrific goal to set around the country, may well be unachievable, and there may well be penalties for that. And so we need to, I think, rewind the issue here. We need to discuss the great opportunity of these energy advancements, but we must also begin to underscore the consequences if we fail to act. It is not without significance that the last time we had a majorly successful effort at a national strategy for an infrastructure project was the interstate highway system in the 1950s. Now, I mention this because all of the same problems existed. It required a realistic plan based on real targets and financial requirements. It required a public-private partnership. It required the cooperation of states all across the country for what was, after all, an interstate activity. It required regulatory reform. And even more impressive, I think, it was budget neutral. So how did they get that particular piece of legislation through? First of all, there was the indispensable idea that there was a national strategy involved. It was also at a time of great competition for scarce resources. Certainly the economic argument was made, as we now know, that for every dollar that was spent on the interstate highway system, there have been $6 returned to the economy. But they had to do it in another way, too. It was both the carrot of future economic development along with the dire consequences if we failed to do it. It is not insignificant that it was called the Defense Highway Act, because the interstate highway was inextricably linked to our national defense. And the reason for that was simple. When Dwight Eisenhower took a convoy in 1919, under assignment from the federal government, he started in Washington, D.C., and went to San Francisco, California, with a number of other officers. This long convoy was mostly trucks driving along the highways and byways of America. That took 2 months. 2 months it took to get across the United States of America, and strategically, between that and understanding the German Autobahn system during World War II, That was enough to inspire a major effort to be undertaken to bring about a national plan for our country that would make it possible to move goods and services, to reunite families, to bring this country to one spot. Today, we need something like this in our grid system. We need to see where these interconnections occur, where the criticality, reliability problems exist, and we need to do it now. There are many important and alarming reports that come out, and yet they drop like a stone when it gets to the public consciousness. And so I would close by saying that we have a great opportunity in front of us. We can't do anything but start on this road. There's so many impressive examples of the projects that are currently underway, and I was impressed by the award winners and look forward to visiting the booths after this talk so I can educate myself more about the terrific plans that are underway. But these plans have to be aligned not only with state policy, but policy in Washington. And I guess at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to have to do to realize this potential? The President mentioned in the State of the Union address that clean energy breakthroughs will only translate into clean energy jobs if businesses know there will be a market for what they're selling. Fair enough, true enough, critically important. But I think industry also needs to have a clear signal on the price of carbon. And if you don't want to link this to climate change because you're still debating the National Academy of Sciences in Washington or, frankly, any other national academy around the world, fair enough. But industry needs to have a price on carbon because this uncertainty has to end. It is a destructive situation when uncertainty is allowed to become the central focus of boardroom decisions. We need to have a national plan that rationalizes costs and benefits and the impacts on jobs. There is an enormous potential in this area. We need regulatory reform. This system was put together, you've heard about it. It was started 100 years ago. It was modernized at various stages of the day, but at this point, much of the technology and interfaces are more than 50 years old. And so even the system that grew up to manage this is also of another era. And so we're going to have to, as General Goodpaster would have said to me, align our goals with our methods. And we're going to have to do this right now. How much political will are we willing to spend on truly modernizing our infrastructure to realize this dream? Much of that depends on you. The solution actually is not just a technical solution, because we know that when innovation is unleashed and we provide a roadmap for investors and the regulatory environment to work hand in hand to assume a job, that can get done. The solution is actually the people and the attitude they bring to this issue. Don't be afraid to tell Americans this is going to be a really hard job. That a little bit of enthusiasm is great, but I can tell you people go right back to sleep and they say, well, isn't it great we've got smart people working on this. The truth is, to modernize and to revamp, to bring into the 21st century, the full electrical system is going to require a change of attitude, a change of approach, and the hard facts, and they are hard, ladies and gentlemen. So that means that we're going to have to start talking to the public in ways they can understand. We shouldn't be afraid of the truth. Americans are starving for the truth. This is what we're not getting. We're only getting the bad news, but we're not looking at how the bad news can be reshifted and turned into an opportunity. Because you and I know that if we were to modernize our system, that the electricity system would bring far more of an investment return than the interstate highway did. And so when we're talking to the public, we have to do it in ways they can understand. We have to change the vocabulary of how we frame this issue. Nobody can trust a cooling tower. Get those images off the television and stop talking about or stop showing cooling towers and start showing the people who are doing the work. Take control over the conversation, but most of all, be sure to have the courage to tell the truth. We must today, I think, because the weather has reminded us of how interdependent we are. We're checking to find out whether my airplane's going to get me back to the East Coast or not. We know from the disruptions in the Middle East how interconnected we are with those events. We know that things that happen in California or Idaho or Georgia have an enormous impact on the way we think about ourselves as a nation. We have to increasingly understand that our regional political interests are inextricably interwoven with our national interests. That if we are going to actually manage our shift, our paradigm shift from the last Cold War superpower standing to a country that now competes and interacts on a different basis, we're going to have to start thinking like Americans again. We're going to have to put aside our political differences and come up with a plan that's going to work for all Americans. I have to say that one of my other great mentors was Alan Simpson, Senator Simpson, who has just managed to survive being on the Deficit Reduction Task Force in Washington. And he once said to me something about partisanship in politics. And he said, comparing a roadway to the political spectrum, he said, you know what we say out there in Wyoming? The only thing in the middle of the road are dead raccoons and squirrels. We have to find ourselves as Americans back in the middle of the road where we can begin to move quickly to bring back the great potential that is our country. We put a man on the moon. We built an interstate highway system. We built the greatest democracy in the world. So it's time that we start thinking like Americans again. Thank you very much.